Have you ever seen a chair left empty, and felt ashamed you didn't ask why? It stood there, near the front, polished like the others, but untouched. No name tag. No flowers. Just stillness. And in that stillness, something unspoken pressed on the heart, like when you realize too late that someone gave everything, and was never invited back. The ceremony moved on. Speeches were read. The dream was honored. But that one chair, a silent witness, held a different kind of memory. Not of triumph, but of sacrifice made in the shadows. Of a man who built the very stage others stood on, and was asked to stay behind the curtain. People clapped. Cameras flashed. But no one turned toward the space he should have filled. It was easier not to. Easier to celebrate the dream than to remember the hands that carried it when it was heavy, controversial, unwanted. He had no plaque. No tribute. Just that quiet, aching vacancy, left like a question that history still hasn't answered. And maybe the question isn't why the chair was empty. Maybe it's, why no one sat in it for him. Bayard Rustin walked with a quiet grace that made people lower their voices without knowing why. He didn't dress for attention, often in a plain suit, shirt pressed just enough, tie a little loose by the end of the day. He moved through offices and back rooms like someone who had long ago accepted he would never be the face of any movement. Only the hands. In meetings, he rarely raised his voice. He listened first. Always. When the younger ones debated loudly, about tactics, about press, about who would stand where, Bayard waited. Then he'd say something soft, steady, like a stone placed gently on a wooden table. And the room, more often than not, shifted around his thought. A man once whispered, "He don't belong here, you know." The words weren't meant to be heard. But Bayard heard them. He simply reached down, picked up a crumpled flyer someone had dropped, folded it neatly, and tucked it into his coat. No reply. No glance. Just that small act of tidying what others threw away. He was black in a country that still chained dignity to color. He was Quaker in a movement of many beliefs, choosing peace where others clenched fists. And he was gay in a time when even allies spoke of him only behind closed doors. But Bayard didn't flinch. Didn't plead. When friends advised him to step back for the sake of optics, he simply said, "If I must walk behind, I will. Just let the road stay open." There was a kind of sorrow in him, but never bitterness. And when he bowed his head before speaking, it felt less like weariness, and more like reverence. As if every word deserved silence before it was born. By the summer of 1963, Bayard Rustin was already moving like a man on borrowed time, measured, deliberate, but always with purpose. The March on Washington was only weeks away, and everything still felt too fragile. Permits weren't finalized. Bus routes kept changing. Churches promised sandwiches, then called back in doubt. But Bayard kept going. Most people never saw his desk. It was a fold-up table pushed against a brick wall in a cramped Harlem office. On it sat a notepad scribbled with routes, volunteers, sound equipment checklists, and, tucked in the corner, a faded photo of Mahatma Gandhi. Bayard never mentioned it, but some of the younger volunteers noticed how he'd glance at it when tension rose, then take a breath before speaking. "Too many moving pieces," one organizer said to him one night, rubbing his eyes. "This might fall apart." Bayard didn't look up. He was drawing a seating map, every bus numbered, every volunteer assigned. He tapped the pencil once, then said quietly, "Movements are made of pieces. We keep them moving. He worked past midnight, most nights. Sometimes alone. He'd check and recheck routes for marches, making sure no elderly person had to walk too far. He assigned water carriers. He listed the first aid stations twice. When others asked who would speak first, who would walk beside Dr. King, Bayard nodded, but never added his own name. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't even listed in the official program. August 28th came with a heat that pressed against the skin. Hundreds of thousands gathered, but it moved like a single body, orderly, peaceful, almost sacred. The world watched in awe, and Dr. King walked to the podium. Bayard didn't follow him. He stood just off stage, half-shadowed by scaffolding and sound cables, his arms crossed gently over his chest. When the first words rang out, "I am happy to join with you today," Bayard closed his eyes. Not for prayer. Not for rest. Just to listen. A reporter brushed past him in a hurry and didn't recognize who he was. Someone offered him a folding chair. He declined. The words climbed and soared. The dream was spoken, and history bent ever so slightly. But in the quiet space behind the voices, Bayard stood still. No applause. No spotlight. Later, a volunteer approached him. "Mr. Rustin," she said, "aren't you going to the press tent?" He shook his head. "No need," he said. They heard what mattered. And then he walked away, gently folding the program in his hands, like a craftsman leaving the theater before the curtain dropped, content in knowing the foundation held. In the days that followed the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin returned to his small office in Harlem. The folding table was still there. The seating charts, the schedules, the volunteer rosters, now just papers with check marks and coffee stains. The phones had stopped ringing. The world had seen something historic, something peaceful, something grand. But here, the silence returned quicker than expected. Newspapers across the country ran front-page stories. Black and white photos of King, of crowds, of the reflecting pool. The word "dream" was printed in bold. And in all those images, Bayard was nowhere to be found. A reporter once asked him, months later, "Don't you think you should have been included in the photos?" Bayard paused, folded his hands, and replied, "The dream isn't made of photographs. It's made of people who show up whether the camera is on or not." He wasn't being noble. He was telling the truth. But the truth had started to carry weight. Within the movement, some voices grew louder. Whispered concerns, polite suggestions. Bayard's background could be used against us, they said. His personal life, it's complicated. A few even asked Dr. King directly if Rustin should step back. The room had been quiet when that conversation happened. King sat at the head of a long table, staring down at his notes. Bayard was not in the room. Someone cleared their throat and said, "It's not about him. It's about how it looks." That evening, King called Bayard in. The room was dim, with only a small desk lamp casting a soft glow. Bayard took the seat across from him, hat still in his hands. "Some of them want you to step away," King said gently. Bayard didn't react. He placed his hat on his knee. "And you?" "I want to keep working with you," King said, honest, tired. "But I won't be able to stop them if they press harder." Bayard nodded. It wasn't anger in his face, just something quieter. A recognition. He stood slowly. "You've got a movement to lead," he said. "I'll walk where you need me." King stood too. I never wanted you in the background. Bayard gave a half-smile. The background's where I work best. And that was that. In the following weeks, Bayard stepped back from the front meetings. He trained new volunteers, mentored young organizers, answered letters from small churches asking how to hold peaceful protests. He never missed a single planning session. But his name was quietly omitted from future press kits. One morning, it rained hard in D.C. A bus from the south had broken down outside the city, carrying mostly elderly men and women from a rural congregation. They had come late, expecting to see monuments. But no one was there to greet them. Except Bayard. He'd gotten a call from a driver who remembered his number. Without telling anyone, Bayard brought umbrellas, a clipboard, and a soft smile. He stood in the rain as each elder stepped off the bus. No press. No cameras. Just him, and their slow, grateful nods. A young boy, barely 10, tugged his sleeve. Are you the guy from the march? Bayard bent down slightly. No, son, he said. But I helped build the road. That night, he hung his wet coat by the door, took off his shoes, and sat at the table in silence. There was no bitterness. Only the tiredness of someone who had given something important, and knew it would never be named. And still, he showed up. Again. And again. Because some people don't need to be remembered to know what they've done. Bayard Rustin never pinned anything to his chest. No medals. No ribbons. Not because he lacked the worth, but because he never believed in wearing proof. For him, justice wasn't something you collected, it was something you carried, quietly, like a folded map in your coat pocket. After the March on Washington, the movement moved on. More marches. More speeches. More spotlights. Bayard kept working, but his name was rarely printed. He taught others how to organize, how to plan, how to hold a room without raising your voice. He showed young leaders how to listen, how to pause before speaking, how to make peace feel powerful. But he was getting older. The pace was slower. His hands sometimes shook when he wrote. One evening, after a training session at a community center, a young man lingered while the others packed up. He looked down at the floor, searching for words. Why don't they talk about you? He asked softly. You were there. You helped build it. Bayard smiled, small and worn. Because the world remembers voices, he said. It forgets echoes. The young man frowned. But echoes last longer. Bayard didn't answer. He just handed him a folder filled with handwritten notes on coalition building. Then, without ceremony, he folded up the last chair and turned off the lights. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, Bayard would sit by the window of his apartment, sipping tea. He watched the street below. People walking to work. A mother crossing the road with her child. A sanitation truck rumbling past. Life continuing, unaware. Inside, on his bookshelf, sat a box he rarely opened. Inside were papers, letters, clippings, and one program from the march, creased at the edges, slightly water-stained. He kept it not for pride, but for memory. The kind you return to when no one else is around to say, you did something good. He never told visitors about it. He never placed it on display. It was enough to know it was there. Because Bayard didn't need the world to clap. He didn't need a podium or a plaque. What he needed, what he believed in, was the work. The invisible labor of dignity. The kind that goes on long after applause has faded. And maybe that's the truest kind of honor. The kind that doesn't hang on a wall. The kind that lives quietly in the choices you make, when no one is watching. In 2013, a chair near the front of the White House ceremony remained unclaimed for a moment too long. The names were called, those receiving the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Applause filled the room, polite and practiced. Then came his. Bayard Rustin. People looked at each other. Some nodded, slowly remembering. A few whispered, about time. But Bayard wasn't there to hear it. He had passed nearly 25 years before. His partner, Walter, accepted the medal on his behalf. He stood straight, not for the cameras, but for the memory. And as he stepped back, he placed his hand gently on the small box that held the medal, then sat down in the seat once meant for Bayard. But the truth is, Bayard's chair had always been there. Through every courtroom, church basement, and bus terminal. Through every moment when someone stepped forward, because he had once stood silently behind them. He didn't vanish. He became part of the quiet structure. The scaffolding no one sees but without which the stage would collapse. Some names are etched into monuments. Others are carried in gestures, like how a young man now pauses before interrupting. Or how a meeting begins with listening instead of noise. Bayard Rustin never needed that chair to be labeled. Because those who truly understand the work, already know who sat there.